Snow fell in thick, deliberate flakes, as if the sky itself meant to bury every sound, every memory. The cabin stood alone on the slope, its timbers groaning under the white weight of winter. Inside, the fire cracked with a tired hunger, licking at its last split logs. Eleni Whitmore leaned closer, her face shadowed by firelight, hands folded in her lap as though clasping silence itself. She had grown used to that silence, the kind that stretched across years until it felt like a second skin. Her neighbors in town, if they thought of her at all, thought of her with pity or suspicion. "Poor girl, no man will have her," the women whispered. "Too strange, too proud, maybe even cursed." The men never spoke, though their glances carried judgment sharper than words. Eleni had chosen solitude over shame, though sometimes at night she could not tell the difference. The wind pressed against the shutters, shaking them like an uninvited guest. She lifted her head. For a moment she thought it was the storm alone. Then she heard it again, a thud, deliberate, human. Her heart skipped and hammered, each beat echoing in the hollowed quiet of her chest. She rose, her bare feet whispering across the rough floorboards. Another knock, muffled by snow, yet urgent. Her hand drifted to the rifle propped near the door. She was no stranger to men who came uninvited in the dark. She set her jaw, drew the latch, and pulled the door open. Snow swirled inward, carrying with it the shape of a man, broad-shouldered and bare to the storm as though it could not touch him. His skin was bronzed, dark hair heavy with frost, and his chest bare beneath a blanket thrown across one shoulder. In his arms he held a little girl, no more than 4, her face pressed against his neck, lashes glittered with melting snow. "Can we stay one night?" His voice was deep, low, as if carved from stone. His eyes did not beg, but neither did they threaten. Eleni's first breath caught between fear and pity. Apache, her mind whispered, the word sharpened by years of stories, by town warnings of raids and savagery. She saw the wide jaw, the scar tracing one shoulder, the solemn gravity of his presence. Yet her eyes slid to the child, whose small hands clung with trust, whose lips trembled in the cold. She did not move aside at once. The storm roared behind him, impatient, sweeping white through the threshold. Her neighbors' voices crowded her mind. "They'll call you shameful, they'll say you've taken a savage into your bed." Still, the girl stirred and whimpered, and something within Eleni broke loose, something tender she had locked away for too many winters. "One night," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, but it carried enough. She stepped back, and the man crossed into the glow of firelight. The door shut on the storm, leaving only the hiss of snow against timber. The man lowered the child gently to the rug near the hearth. She curled toward the warmth like a kitten, eyes half shut with exhaustion. Eleni knelt and pulled a quilt from her cedar chest, tucking it around the little girl. Her hands trembled at the nearness of innocence. She glanced up and found the man watching her, his gaze unreadable. "You'll find no comfort here," she said softly, not as warning but as confession. "Only bread, a fire and silence." "That is enough," he answered. His voice seemed to settle into the walls, steady and heavy as falling snow. For a long time, they did not speak. He crouched near the fire, feeding it with kindling from a bundle at his side. His movements economical, sure. Eleni watched as flame leapt higher, shadows carving hollows in his face. She wondered what road had left him shirtless in a storm, carrying a child alone. She did not ask. Questions felt dangerous, as if they might shatter the fragile peace between strangers. Instead she fetched bread, hard with age, and set it near the fire to soften. The child stirred at the scent, blinking awake. Her eyes were wide and luminous, catching the glow like 2 drops of dawn. She looked at Eleni, not with suspicion, but with the open trust of one too young to know the cruelty of the world. "What is her name?" Eleni asked, surprising herself. "Noya," he said, the syllables low and reverent. He touched the girl's hair gently, pride hidden in restraint. Eleni nodded. The name clung to her tongue like a prayer. She had not spoken another's name aloud in days, maybe weeks. It sounded strange, tender, almost dangerous. They ate in silence, though the crackle of fire filled the emptiness between them. Outside, the wind howled and rattled, as though furious at being shut out. Inside, warmth began to spread, though it carried with it the ache of vulnerability. When the bread was gone, Eleni returned to her chair, pulling her shawl close. The man lay back on the floor near his daughter, the blanket covering them both. His presence filled the small cabin, not threatening but undeniable. She closed her eyes and felt her heart press against her ribs, restless. She had let strangers into her home. Worse, she had let him in, the kind of man the town would condemn her for sheltering. Yet as she watched the child's slow breathing and the father's still form beside her, she felt something stir within her that had not stirred in years. Not desire, not yet. Something simpler. The fragile relief of not being entirely alone. The storm battered on through the night, shaking the rafters, groaning against the shutters. Each gust carried the memory of gossip, of laughter sharp as knives. Eleni lay awake, listening. She wondered what price she would pay come morning for this act of mercy. Yet each time fear gripped her, she looked toward the fire and saw the small form under the quilt, the dark figure watchful beside her, and her heart steadied. As dawn bled pale through the cracks in the shutters, the fire burned low. Noya stirred, her small voice murmuring in a language Eleni did not know. The man soothed her with a word, his tone softer than the storm outside. Eleni's throat ached at the sound, at the unfamiliar gentleness wrapped in a stranger's voice. She rose to lay another log on the fire, her fingers brushing against his as he reached for the same piece of wood. They froze, heat startling as flame. He did not draw back. Neither did she. For an instant the silence deepened, heavy with something unspoken, something neither of them had permission to name. Then Noya coughed, breaking the spell. Eleni pulled away, the log tumbling into the hearth, sparks rising like startled birds. Her heart thudded as she straightened. The man's eyes lingered, steady and unreadable, yet not unkind. The storm had passed, but outside lay a world sharpened by cold, a world that would see and judge. Eleni felt it pressing against her door, waiting. She wondered if she had already stepped beyond the threshold of her old life. And then came the sound again, knuckles rapping at her door. Another visitor. Another witness. Her breath caught. The world she had tried to keep out was already here. The storm did not release them at dawn. Snow lay heavy against the cabin walls, drifted thick across the clearing, and the sky pressed low with the weight of more to come. Eleni stood at the small window, her breath clouding the glass, and felt the truth settle in her bones. They could not leave, not yet. Behind her, Noya stirred beneath the quilt, blinking awake, cheeks flushed with the heat of the fire. The father, Tahu, she had learned from the girl's half-whispered murmur in the night, rose quietly, as if the creak of boards might break something fragile. He moved with the same silent strength as the trees bowed under the storm, steady, unshaken. Eleni kept her voice low. The road will be closed for days. Tahu only inclined his head, as if he had already expected such fate. His eyes traveled the small space, resting on the stack of wood dwindling near the hearth. He took his coatless frame into the storm without asking. Eleni's hand twitched toward the latch, torn between stopping him and trusting that he knew more of snow and survival than she ever could. She watched through the window as he split wood, bare arms flexing against the frost, breath rising white, each strike of the axe echoing like defiance. Noya's laughter startled her. The child had taken to chasing the curls of smoke that seeped from the fire, her tiny hands clapping with delight. The sound filled the cabin with a warmth Eleni had not heard in years. She bent, her hands gentle as she smoothed the girl's tangled hair. "You'll bring the whole storm down with such noise," she whispered, though her lips betrayed a smile. By the time Tahu returned, snow glazed his shoulders, and he carried not just wood but a snared rabbit, its limp form proof of his quiet efficiency. He laid it on the table, eyes flicking to hers, waiting for refusal. She only nodded, already fetching the knife. Together they skinned it in silence, the rhythm of the work binding them in a language older than words. Later, when the stew simmered and the cabin smelled of herbs and meat, Eleni caught herself humming. She stopped abruptly, shame flushing her cheeks. But Noya hummed it back, her high childish notes carrying the tune like a banner of innocence. Tahu looked up from where he sharpened his blade, the faintest curve softening his mouth, and for a heartbeat Eleni felt as if she belonged to something more than silence. Yet outside, belonging was not hers to claim. On the second morning, the sound of hoofbeats shattered the hush. Eleni stiffened. Through the frost-blurred glass she glimpsed two riders passing along the ridge. They slowed, craning their necks toward the thin plume of smoke curling from her chimney. Her stomach clenched. The town would talk. It always did. By dusk, she knew the gossip had begun. She could feel it seeping through the snow like smoke under a door. In town, Silas Carter would already be wagging his tongue. Saw Whitmore's cabin smoking bright, reckon she ain't so alone as she pretends. The others would nod, leaning close over mugs of bitter coffee, their words sharpening with each telling. An Apache, they say, bare to the storm, bold as sin. That night, Eleni lay restless while Noya slept beside the hearth. Her small hand curled around a rag doll Eleni had sewn from scraps. The man lay near his daughter, eyes open, unblinking in the glow of embers. She felt his awareness reach her in the dark. It pressed against her chest heavier than the snow on the roof. "You should know," she murmured, though she did not know why she spoke. "They will not forgive me this." He said nothing, only turned his face toward the ceiling. Yet his silence held understanding. The storm dragged on, and with it came small rhythms that softened the sharp edges of fear. Tahu mended the shutter with wood hewn from the slope, his hands deft with tools she had thought rusted useless. Noya followed Eleni like a shadow, delighting in chores, her laughter echoing in corners where even Eleni's voice had not reached. At times Eleni forgot to guard her heart, forgot the weight of what the town might think. At times, she even forgot her solitude. Until the third day, when she braved the road for flour. The sky was brittle blue, the snow crunching underfoot as she stepped into town. Every eye turned. Eleni Mayfield, kind-eyed widow, gave a small nod of greeting, but others drew their coats tighter, lips curling with knowing smirks. Silas Carter leaned against the post outside the store, his gaze sliding over her like grease. "Storm kept you warm, did it?" He drawled loud enough for others to hear. Laughter stirred among the loafers, sharp and cutting. Eleni's cheeks burned. She kept her chin high, though her hands shook as she gathered flour, beans, salt. Their whispers followed her like hounds. "Took him in, sure as sin." Savage blood in her house now. By the time she reached her cabin again, her breath was ragged. She paused before the door, listening to the muffled sound of Noya's laughter inside. For a moment she considered barring it all out. The man, the child, the town, the shame. Yet when she stepped inside, Noya flung herself into her arms with innocent joy, and Eleni felt the cold words of town gossip shatter like brittle glass. Still, the wound remained. That evening, when Tahu reached for her basket of logs, his hand brushed hers. She flinched, not from his touch but from the thought of eyes that might see, tongues that might twist. He withdrew at once, dignity intact, but something unspoken passed between them. She was caught between mercy and ruin, and he knew it. Noya pressed the rag doll into Eleni's lap, her smile untroubled by adult shadows. The gesture broke her heart open. She stroked the child's hair, her silence a vow she did not yet understand. Night deepened. The stew pot was nearly empty, the fire low. Eleni sat by the window, staring out at the moonlit snow. In the distance, faint against the wind, she thought she heard another sound. Hoofbeats again, lingering too long near her cabin. Watching. Judging. Her pulse quickened. She turned, her eyes meeting Tahu's across the room. He was standing, broad and still, his face unreadable. But his hand rested lightly on the hilt of his knife. The world outside had already decided its story. The question that pressed against her ribs, hotter than fire, colder than snow, was whether she would accept it, or stand against it. The days that followed were carved from snow and silence, yet within that silence something began to stir, like embers hidden under ash. The storm did not lift but pressed harder, the wind scouring the land, the sky a ceaseless gray lid. Eleni felt her world narrowing to the cabin, the fire, the two strangers who now shaped her days. Tahu rose before dawn, moving through the snow with the patience of a man who knew it could kill him if he rushed. He returned with rabbits, once a fox, sometimes only with frost in his hair, and a bundle of branches in his arms. Eleni watched through the slivered glass, breath catching as he trudged through drifts taller than her waist, bare chest glistening with cold, his body both defiant and humbled by winter. She could not decide whether he seemed invincible or mortal in a way that pierced her. Noia filled the hours with laughter, small hands busy with scraps of cloth and sticks, her chatter breaking through the hush that had ruled Eleni's cabin for years. At first Eleni thought herself unfit for the child's light, her own voice stiff and halting. But Noia never noticed the clumsiness. She accepted each word like a gift, answering with unguarded joy. It was during one of those mornings that Tahu returned with more than game. His arm bore a deep scrape from brambles hidden under snow, blood bright against his skin. Eleni gasped despite herself, fetching a basin, cloth, and the few herbs she had left from autumn. "Sit," she said, her voice sharper than she intended, softened only by the tremor of her hands. He lowered himself without protest, though his eyes held the quiet endurance of one used to pain. She cleaned the wound carefully, breath shallow as her fingers traced the scarred plane of his shoulder. Old marks crisscrossed his skin, remnants of battles, of survival written in flesh. She wondered what stories lay buried there, how many winters had tested him. Her hands shook as she tied the bandage. "You carry more scars than one man should." His gaze lifted, steady, unflinching. "Scars do not lie. They tell what we endure." The words settled heavy in her chest, echoing deeper than he could know. For years she had carried her own scars, not on her skin but in the whispers that clung to her name. Scars no fire could warm away. When he rose, he murmured thanks in his tongue, the sound like wind in pine branches. She did not understand the words, yet she felt their weight, their sincerity. That evening, when the stew bubbled with the last of the rabbit, she set an extra portion before him without comment. He inclined his head, and in the flicker of firelight, their silence felt less like a wall, more like a bridge. As the storm deepened, so did their rhythm. She found herself mending his blanket with careful stitches, her needle glinting in the lamplight, while he carved wood into small figures for his daughter. He said little, but the act itself spoke of tenderness, of a father's wish to fill a child's world with more than hunger and cold. Noia showed her treasures to Eleni with shining eyes, and Eleni marveled at how quickly affection could seep past walls she had thought unbreakable. Still, shadows lingered. Each night when the wind howled, she thought of the town, of Silas Carter's sneer, of women who crossed the street rather than meet her eyes. Shame pressed her throat, though within these walls another voice grew louder, telling her she was not wrong to offer shelter, not wrong to wish for something more than silence. One night, after Noia had drifted to sleep, Eleni found herself staring into the fire. "They will not forgive me," she whispered. Tahu's eyes reflected the flames. "They do not forgive me either." The words bound them together with a sudden, startling intimacy. Her breath caught, and for a moment she could not look away. He had said more in those 6 words than most men said in a lifetime. She felt the truth of it in her bones, that here was another soul cast out, scarred by judgment, surviving in defiance of it. Their silence after was not empty. It was heavy, brimming with something unnamed. She turned back to the fire, but her pulse beat wild, as though her own body betrayed what her tongue dared not. The next day, hunger forced them beyond the cabin. The snow was cruel, a world of white knives, but they walked side by side into the pines. Breath smoked from their mouths, boots crunching, each step binding them to the land and to each other. He moved with certainty, guiding her where drifts concealed danger, offering his hand when ice glistened underfoot. Once, when she slipped, his arm caught her waist, pulling her against him with sudden strength. For a breathless second she felt the heat of his body, the steadiness of his grip. Shame and longing burned in equal measure. She pulled back quickly, murmuring thanks, though her heart was no longer hers alone. They found tracks, followed them, and by dusk returned with game enough for days. Back at the cabin, she worked the meat while he stacked the wood, their movements weaving together like threads in a single cloth. When their hands brushed across the table, neither withdrew. The touch was fleeting, but it lingered in the air long after. That night when Noia nestled close to sleep, Tahu sat sharpening his knife, the rasp of stone on steel steady and slow. Eleni watched, her shawl drawn tight, the firelight painting his face in shifting gold. She thought of how easily he could defend her, how his presence filled the room with strength, and how dangerous it was to want that strength for herself. She forced her gaze away, but the ache remained, deeper than loneliness, heavier than shame. She wondered if she was strong enough to bear it, if she was brave enough to keep them, even as the world sharpened its tongue against her. Outside, the storm paused, and for the first time stars broke through the veil of clouds. Eleni stepped to the door, breath catching at their fragile brilliance. Behind her she heard the faint shuffle of footsteps. He had followed, silent as ever, standing just behind her shoulder. For a moment they shared the night, two figures at the threshold, the child's soft breathing within, the endless white beyond. His hand brushed hers on the doorframe, not a claim, not even a promise, only a question, unspoken yet fierce. Her pulse raced. She did not answer, not yet. But she did not pull away. And in the distance, faint as the memory of laughter, came the sound of riders moving through the dark, circling closer. When the storm finally broke, it left the world sharp and brittle. Snow crusted the fields, dazzling under the pale sun, but the air was colder than before, carrying with it a clarity that cut to the bone. Eleni knew the peace inside her cabin could not last. The fire had given them warmth, the days had carved a fragile rhythm of survival, but outside lay a world that judged with eyes sharper than knives. She wrapped herself in her shawl and walked the rutted road into town, basket at her arm. Behind her, smoke curled from the chimney where Tahu and Noya remained. She could feel its weight on her back, as though it announced her shame for all to see. The general store was warm with bodies, crowded against the cold. The air smelled of coffee and tobacco, of leather dampened by snow. Conversation hushed when she entered. She felt the silence gather around her like a noose. Eleni Mayfield, kind-faced in her morning black, gave her a quick smile and touched her arm in greeting. But Silas Carter leaned against the counter, his grin oily, his voice carrying. "Well, if it ain't the Snow Queen herself. Looks like she finally found herself some company up there in that cabin." Laughter pricked the room like thorns. Eleni kept her chin high, fingers tightening around her basket. She did not answer, only set her list before the storekeeper. Flour, salt, beans. Her voice clipped, businesslike, though her cheeks burned hot enough to melt snow. Silas was not finished. "Heard tell you've taken in a savage. Bold choice, Whitmore. Mighty bold." The word rang out, thick with venom. Savage. The town swallowed it, eyes shifting, mouths tightening. She felt their judgment pressing down, heavier than any storm. Eleni's voice, quiet but steady, broke through. "She's done nothing wrong offering shelter. Any of us would, with a child in need." But the defense only drew more laughter. Silas leaned close, his breath reeking of whiskey. Sure. Shelter. That what you call it?" The storekeeper cleared his throat, slid her purchases forward. His hands trembled as though eager to be done with her. Eleni gathered them quickly, refusing to let her voice break. Yet as she stepped outside into the blinding snow, her heart shook. The ride home was longer than the road itself. Every hoofbeat echoed the whispers she could not silence. "She's harboring him. She's lost her virtue. She was always strange, now she's proved it." The words wrapped around her like chains. At the cabin door, she paused. Smoke rose steady. Inside, Noya's laughter spilled through the cracks, warm as sunlight. Eleni closed her eyes. She wanted to leave the basket there, walk into the woods, let the snow bury her. But instead she lifted the latch and stepped inside. Tahu looked up from where he was carving wood by the fire. Noya rushed to her, arms outstretched, proud of a crude little horse she carried. Eleni bent and took the child close, breathing in her warmth, letting it steady her trembling. "They know," she whispered without meaning to. Tahu's gaze held hers. There was no surprise in it, only inevitability. They always knew. The word stung. He spoke not of this town alone but of every town, every border where his kind was marked as other, where shame was ready-made. She turned from him, set the basket down too hard, the jars rattling inside. That night, she barely touched her food. The fire popped, Noya chattered, but Eleni felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing against her windows. When Tahu rose to stoke the fire, she found herself blurting, "Maybe you should go, before they come here." The words hung between them, colder than the snow outside. His face did not change, but his stillness was a kind of wound. "If you wish it, I will." Her throat tightened. She had not meant it, at least not with her heart. Yet fear had forced her tongue. She looked at Noya, who nestled against her father, eyes heavy with sleep. The thought of them vanishing from her cabin left her breathless, hollow. She shook her head. "No. Not yet. The storm still lingers." Something softened in his eyes, but he did not press. They let the fire speak for them until sleep claimed the child and silence fell heavier than snow. The next morning, hoofbeats returned. This time they did not pass. Lanterns flickered outside the cabin, voices carrying. Eleni's pulse thundered as she moved to the window. 4 men stood in the snow, their breath smoking, their faces hard. Silas Carter's voice called out, "Whitmore! Bring him out. We won't have savages lying up in decent homes. You want to shame yourself, that's your choice, but we won't stomach him here." Her hands shook on the latch. Tahu stood all ready, silent as a tree, knife at his side, Noya clinging to his leg with wide eyes. Eleni's breath came ragged. The moment she had dreaded was here. She looked from the child to the father, then to the door that trembled with fists pounding. Her voice trembled, but it rose from somewhere deeper than fear. "This is my house," she whispered, almost to herself, "and no one will decide who belongs here but me." The pounding grew louder. She lifted her chin, turned the latch, and pulled the door open. Cold and judgment rushed in together. Silas stood at the front, lantern in hand, eyes gleaming with triumph. Behind him the others shifted, rifles slung at their shoulders. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Snow swirled around them, carrying the hush of a world holding its breath. Then Eleni stepped forward onto the threshold, her shawl whipping in the wind, her face pale but her eyes steady. Behind her, the fire cast Tahu's shadow large against the wall, and Noya's small form clung beside him. She felt the town's judgment pressing harder than ever. Yet for the first time, she did not bow under it. "Leave us be," she said, her voice trembling but unbroken. Silas's grin widened, cruel as the cold. "Or what, girl? You'll fight us with him at your side." The lantern light caught his sneer, the rifles shifting behind him. Eleni's pulse beat so loud she thought the snow itself could hear. And from within the cabin came the sound of steel sliding free, low and certain. The night shuddered with silence after the scrape of steel, the kind of silence that bends even the snow to stillness. Eleni stood on the threshold, breath frosting the air, the cold biting at her cheeks. The men before her shifted uneasily, their rifles gleaming in lantern light. Behind her the fire flared, throwing Tahu's tall frame against the wall, his knife gleaming. Noya pressed close to him, her small face pale with fear. "Step aside, Whitmore," Silas Carter snarled, though his bravado cracked at the edges. "That savage don't belong here. We're ending this tonight." Eleni's hands trembled, but she did not move. The shame that had shackled her for years, the whispers and sneers that had sent her into silence, now hardened into something else. She drew herself taller, shawl snapping in the wind. "This is my home," she said, her voice raw but unwavering. "And those inside it belong here." The men muttered, their boots crunching the snow. Silas sneered, stepping closer, lantern swinging. "You'll ruin yourself, girl. Town won't forget. You'll be cast out forever." Her heart pounded, but her reply came from a place deeper than fear. "I've lived with your gossip all my life. It cannot take from me what I never owed you." The words startled even her, as if spoken by someone braver. The men glanced at one another, uncertain. The lantern light quivered, shadows jittering across the snow. Behind her, Tahu's voice rose, calm and steady. "We seek no quarrel. Leave, and there will be peace." Silas sparked a laugh, harsh and ugly.
"Peace? With your kind?"
"You should have frozen in the storm." He raised his rifle, the lantern swinging higher, light spilling across his cruel grin. Noya whimpered. Eleni's body moved before her mind could catch it. She stepped fully in front of the doorway, arms spread wide as if her small frame could shield them both. "You'll have to go through me." The words rang into the night, carried by wind, carried by firelight. For a heartbeat, the men froze, taken aback by her defiance. Silas's sneer faltered, but pride kept his finger near the trigger. Then another voice cut the air. "Enough." Eleni Mayfield emerged from the shadows, her lantern lifting, her figure cloaked in black but her eyes blazing. She had followed them, silent witness until now. "You'll shame yourselves more than her if you spill blood here tonight. A woman took in a child and a father in a storm. That is no sin but mercy. And mercy is something this town has sorely lacked." The other men stirred uneasily. One lowered his rifle, shame flickering across his face. Silas hissed, but Eleni's gaze held them like iron. "Go home, all of you. Let her live." The weight of her words, spoken from a widow marked by loss, broke the fever of the mob. Slowly, mutters rising, the men withdrew. Lanterns bobbed into the distance, their light shrinking into the cold dark until only Silas remained. His eyes burned with fury. "This ain't over," he spat, before spurring his horse and vanishing into the night. The silence after was heavier than the storm had ever been. Eleni sagged against the doorframe, trembling. Eleni stepped forward, laid a hand on her arm. "Hold fast, child. You've done right." Then she, too, turned back toward the road, her lantern fading. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned, throwing warmth against the chill that clung to Eleni's skin. She closed the door and leaned against it, breath unsteady. Tahu stood where she had left him, his knife sheathed now, his dark eyes steady upon her. "You put yourself in front of me," he said quietly, not as a question but a truth that shook the room. Her voice cracked. "I couldn't let them take you. Or her." For a long moment, they only stared at one another, the fire hissing, Noya's soft breathing filling the silence. Then the little girl toddled forward, her small hand reaching for Eleni. Without thinking, Eleni knelt and gathered her close. Noya nestled against her neck, warm and trusting. Something shifted within Eleni then, as if the years of silence and shame had been cracked open by that simple gesture. For once she did not feel empty. She felt claimed, not by gossip, not by loneliness, but by the small hand clutching her collar, and the man whose gaze carried both gratitude and something deeper, wordless but strong. When at last Noya slept, Eleni sat by the fire, the child in her lap. Tahu crouched across from her, the flames painting gold into the planes of his scarred face. His voice was low, almost reverent. "You have given us more than shelter. You have given us a home, if only for a while." Her throat tightened. "And if the town never forgives me?" "Forgiveness is not theirs to give." His words rang like iron. Tears she had not known she carried welled in her eyes. She blinked them back, but one slipped free, glistening in the firelight. Tahu did not move to wipe it away. Instead, his gaze held hers, steady and unyielding, as though he offered her the dignity she had long been denied. The fire burned lower, and dawn pressed pale against the shutters. Outside, snow still cloaked the world, but within, a fragile warmth had taken root. Eleni laid Noya down, tucked the quilt around her, and stood. Tahu rose as well, his height filling the cabin, his silence thick with meaning. For a moment they only stood, facing each other, the distance between them charged with everything unspoken. Then, slowly, her hand lifted, resting against his scarred shoulder. It was not a promise, not yet. But it was not fear either. It was a choice, a beginning. His hand covered hers, large and calloused, and the fire cast them both in a single glow. In that quiet, Eleni felt something bloom inside her that she had thought buried by years of ridicule. Dignity, fierce and unshaken. The first rays of sun broke over the horizon, spilling light across the snow, igniting the frost like fire. Inside, the cabin held three figures, woman, warrior, child, bound not by words, not by permission of town or church, but by survival, by mercy, by the courage to stand together when the world turned against them. And yet, faint on the morning wind, came the echo of Silas Carter's vow. "This ain't over."